In our collection of Sparta, there is only one empty area left. Our channel has a video about the life of the Spartans, and also a video about the history of Sparta. The only thing we are missing is the myths that surround the history of one of the most famous states of antiquity. Were the Spartans really gods of war? Why were women in Sparta more popular than men? And where did the culture in Sparta come from? If, as they say, all men were engaged in military affairs, friends, get ready. We will tell you all the details. Let's start with the history of the superiority of the Spartan army and their way of life. Ironically, these stories have come down to us in the form of legends, thanks in part to Hitler. Most of the myths that exalted Sparta come from Roman and Renaissance sources. It was at this time that Sparta had already lost its strength and greatness, but for some it was beneficial. Comparing themselves with the followers of the idea of King Leonidas, they created these myths. Modern 20th century scientists would debunk these myths, and in our time, the situation with Sparta would resemble the situation with Neanderthals, who were previously considered primitive. We now know that they were quite advanced for their time. However, there was another snag with Sparta. At one time, Hitler admired her and encouraged the Germans to imitate her, restricting full citizens and promoting the idea of racial superiority. These ideas are so strongly intertwined with the image of the Spartans that for some time historians, Sparta was something of a taboo. She was studied, but tried to avoid mentioning their names in connection with her. In scientific works, she was next to war criminals. Thus, myths about Sparta continued to circulate without official refutation. In fact, the Spartans were outstanding, but at the same time typical representatives of their era. Here we will begin to analyze the first myth associated with the Spartan army. One can endlessly admire her martial prowess, but to call them soldiers, always ready to fight to the last and never give up, would be wrong. Confirmation of this can be found in inconvenient facts from history. One such case is the battle with the Sophians on the island of Factoria in 425 BC, which was a common battle during the Peloponnesian War. Less than 2,000 fighters from both sides participated in this battle. However, it turned into a real psychological thriller with an unexpected turn of events. The plot twist was that after the battle, 292 Spartans were captured, of which 120 were full citizens of Sparta. At that time, this was a huge number, which indicates that even such invincible warriors could find themselves in a difficult situation. Factoria Island was under blockade by the Athenian fleet. About 500 Spartans were under siege. Their allies could only bring food to the island by night sorties. The Athenians skillfully used tactics, not engaging in direct confrontation and shelling the garrison with archers. Thus, the situation is far from the myth that the Spartans always fight to the end. Once in the place of the Spartans, any other army would most likely be ready to surrender. Realizing that the chances of survival for the soldiers besieged in the blockade are negligible. But the myth of the steadfastness of the Spartans brought an additional aspect to the story that requires a deeper analysis. Sparta, in addition to surrender, also asked Athens for a truce for humanitarian aid to soldiers garrisoned in Factory. As part of this request, the Spartans unilaterally handed over 60 ships to the Athenians and agreed to refrain from attacking their fortifications, both on land and at sea. They also sent envoys to negotiate a meaningful peace. However, this proposal was rejected and the war continued. However, the important fact for us is that the Spartans were far from being unshakable iron warriors with a rigid code. They were also people who could give up, negotiate, and realize the futility of resistance. The only compliment that can be given to Sparta after the battle with Factoria is that they really fought to the limit of their strength, which surprised the Factorians. This fact emphasizes that the Spartans were not invincible. They were ordinary people who understood when the moment came to give up or stop resisting. This is important to consider in order to understand the following myth, which concerns the courage of Spartan men. While there were legends about the power of Spartan men in Greece at that time, in fact, the legends were more often associated with women. This is manifested in ancient stories that have come down to us thanks to the Roman Encyclopedia of the Court, begun in the 10th century. One of the legends tells how representatives of a small city in Greece turned to the Delphic oracle, asking which of them is the most powerful inhabitants of the region. The oracle replied that in fact the most powerful inhabitants were the horses of Thessaly, the Spartan women, and the inhabitants between Tarenth and Arcadia, and the Argives. This oracle response highlights two important points. First of all, it should be noted why he strangely remembers Spartan women and not men. Secondly, he emphasizes that he considers the inhabitants of Argos to be the best warriors in the region. Here, excluding mythological aspects, everything is clear and obvious. Spartan women were admired throughout Greece, for they had a status comparable to that of men. Spartan women participated in sports, received education, received military training, and even had the right to initiate a divorce from a man. Several thousand male Spartan citizens ruled over many slaves and serfs, and when the men went to war, the women not only took care of the household, but also took on additional responsibilities. In addition, they had the right to organize sports competitions and even carry out cuffs. That is why they were admired throughout Greece, while the inhabitants of Athens, for example, could only dream of such rights. As for Argos, according to Herodotus, in 550 BC, a battle of champions took place between the city and Sparta. To avoid bloodshed, both sides allegedly fielded 300 of the best fighters each, arranging a royal battle. As a result, 1 Spartan and 2 fighters from Argos remained. This, of course, also sounds like a legend, but it is worth noting that the superiority of the warriors from Argos over the Spartans is again mentioned here. And secondly, it is worth noting that Argos was not the absolute dominant center of that time, so that historians could rewrite real events in its favor. Usually legends can distort the events themselves, but the plot and general atmosphere should be logical for the reader. It's like a logical world where Marvel superheroes exist. In ancient Greek stories, the strength of the warriors from Argos was constantly affirmed, which probably was the case. Another interesting point is that a much larger number of citizens lived in Sparta than in Argos. Sparta was in a position to field the largest land army in Greece and did not need to be absolutely in charge to exert a dominant influence. The main part of the story about the Spartan warriors, presented as naked to the waist, scattering dozens of opponents at once, is a fantasy of later eras, generated by fans of Laconia. Ironically, these fantasies often lack real grounds for Sparta's superiority. The main reason for its dominance was not so much military power as a unique organizational structure. In Sparta, young men were taught not only to fight, but also to manage. To this end, the phalanxes were divided into detachments of 15 people for more precise execution of orders. In addition, the uniform and order emphasized the brotherhood and unity of the detachment. This made the Spartan army an efficient machine, able to scatter weakly organized opponents. However, even when recruiting slaves or residents of allied cities into the army, they quickly learned to walk information and follow orders, turning from ordinary people into an army. It was for this reason that the Romans, who adapted Sparta's approach, admired her. In terms of their military doctrine, they also admired Spartan approaches. Now let's turn our attention away from the military aspects and talk about something less serious, like bees. It is probably hard to imagine a Spartan song about love for nature, flowers, and bees. This is highly unlikely. Sparta was dominated by military marches and songs about victories, emphasizing unity and power. Unfortunately, the texts of the original Spartan authors have come down to our times, and although some Tyrtaeus could have songs about battles with Misgawi, almost the entire creative era of another musician, Alcman, was devoted to cheerful verses about beautiful girls and, of course, bees. Alcman, who lived in Sparta at the end of the 7th century BC, created musical works that reflected the lighter side of life. Who even allowed such heresy to be written? If you remember that Alcman was a child of slaves, then he should have been immediately thrown off the cliff, right? However, in reality, Alcman was buried with honor next to the grave of Helen of Troy. This happened because few people in Sparta objected. After all, if men were engaged not only in war, then surely someone had to be engaged in the manufacture of spoons, the training of diplomats, and the proceedings in agriculture. In most cases, slaves were involved in such cases. Despite the fact that the Spartan citizens considered themselves above this, they, nevertheless, were forced to understand everyday issues in order to have control over them. The education that the Spartans received was not only military, but also classical, and in their free time, when they reached a more mature age, their hobbies were varied. At present, the School of Nottingham can be considered the pioneer of a new approach to the study of Sparta. There, at the university, under the direction of Stephen Hodkinson, scientists are making up for decades of taboos on the study of the Spartans after World War II. And recent studies conclude that Sparta's dominance in Greece was primarily achieved not only through military force, but also through diplomacy and smart politics. This created the impression among the free citizens of other cities that the Spartans who controlled the slaves were exactly the ones who should be imitated. Oligarchic regimes similar to the Spartan periodically came to power in different cities, including Athens. Therefore, from the point of view of historical analysis, Sparta should be considered as an unusual, but in the same era similar to other cities' policy, and not as a semi-mythical state of invincible warriors.